Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers how marine mammals load up on oxygen before a dive. To address this question, we first need to understand where oxygen is stored in the body. These are called oxygen reservoirs. Then we're going to look at some techniques for actually enhancing oxygen storage before a dive. And finally, we'll turn to phocids, some of our deepest divers, and take a look at their anatomical adaptations within the circulatory system that helps them load up on oxygen before a dive. So the first question is, where do we store oxygen? And to address that, it's useful to actually look at humans as a starting point. So humans can hold about 20 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body. To give you a frame of reference, the average male weighs about 70 kilograms. So if you take that average male, this means that you're basically looking at about 1,400 milliliters of oxygen. Roughly, that's about 3/4 of a 2-liter bottle's worth of oxygen that's stored somewhere in that body mass. So where is it stored? It's not random. It tends to be concentrated in specific tissues or organs, namely the lung airspace. So when we take a look at the lungs, we know that the lungs have all these tubes and alveoli that can hold some just basic oxygen. So a lot of it's there, about 24% is there. Most of it is in the blood. 57% of oxygen that's in a person's body is stored in their blood. And this is because the blood contains red blood cells, and the red blood cells themselves contain a molecule known as hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is actually what transports the oxygen around. And then finally, a small amount is actually stored within the skeletal muscles, about 15% for humans. So if humans can store 20 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass, how much can be stored in marine mammals? Well, as you might expect, they can store more, and they need to store more because what they're doing is they're doing apnea, where they're holding their breath as they try to conduct a dive. So in order to be able to do that, they've got to be able to hold more oxygen in their body. So again, using that per kilogram of body, we see that delphinidae, which are really just the standard common dolphins and orcas, can hold about 35 milliliters of oxygen. We see that otariids, which are our fur seals, and our sea lions can hold about 40 milliliters of oxygen, and our phocids can hold 60 milliliters of oxygen. So here's the conclusion. Marine mammals can hold between 2 and 3 times as much oxygen per kilogram of body mass compared to a terrestrial mammal like a human. So here's what this means. If you were to take a human like myself and then put a small dolphin or porpoise next to me of the same size, they would be able to hold anywhere between 2 and 3 times as much oxygen in their body. In other words, think 2 or even 3 2-liter bottles worth compared to me, where I just have about 3/4 worth of a 2-liter bottle of oxygen inside of me. And this is especially impressive because in an earlier lecture we learned that their lungs tend to be reduced for their size. So they have smaller than expected lungs, which is needed because when they dive, they are at risk of the bends. So where do they store their oxygen? We know they can store more. Where do they store it? And as you might expect, it's not the same distribution as we see for humans. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and take a look at each one of these groups, the delphinidae, the otariids, and the phocids, and figure out where are they storing their oxygen, and we'll use humans, which represents a standard terrestrial mammal, as reference. So we'll start with the delphinidae. The dolphins actually store a fair amount in their lungs, not as much in their blood, but a whole whopping 48% in their skeletal muscles. So that's very impressive. So when we think about the dolphins and the delphinidae, really they're looking at putting all of their oxygen stored in the muscle. On a pie chart, we can see this more graphically, where we see in the pie chart the green represents the muscle storage, and in humans it's not very significant, but in dolphins and most other cetaceans, with the exception of the sperm whale, tend to use the muscles heavily as a storage spot for that oxygen. Now, the otariids don't quite do it that way. The otariids, which again are going to be your fur seals and your sea lion, they actually put most of their oxygen in the blood, just like humans do. But remember, they're not exactly like humans because they can actually store twice as much oxygen as a comparably sized human. And then even more impressive is going to be the phocids. The phocids, which store a mere 7% of oxygen in their lung space, showing how insignificant that space is, stores 65% of their oxygen in blood. So while cetaceans tend to use muscles more heavily than blood, the pinnipeds, like the otariids and the phocids, tend to use the blood. And again, on a graph, we can see this more starkly, where we see that the importance of blood is very, very high, and the importance of lung airspace, which is represented by blue, decreases with deeper divers. So the deeper diver you have, and phocids as a rule dive deeper than otariids, the less important airspace becomes and the more important blood becomes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at some of the mechanics behind that. How could you store more oxygen in muscles? How could you store more oxygen in blood? And we'll go ahead and start with muscles. So it turns out that your skeletal muscles contain a molecule known as myoglobin. Myoglobin is actually very similar to hemoglobin that is found in red blood cells. Myoglobin attracts oxygen and therefore acts as an oxygen store. So it makes sense that the more myoglobin you add to a muscle, the more oxygen storage capacity that muscle is going to have. So particularly for cetaceans, we would expect that these animals have a lot of myoglobin in their muscles, and indeed they do. Marine mammals have anywhere between 3 and 5 times as much myoglobin per gram of muscle tissue compared to a human. So that explains how you can add oxygen to muscles. What about blood? Well, to enhance an organism's ability to store oxygen in the blood, we can basically approach it with 2 different adaptations. One is simply to increase the blood volume, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The second is to take a drop of blood and increase the percentage of red blood cells that are actually found in the blood. In a human, when we actually take a drop of blood, we can apply it to a centrifuge, and when we do that, all the red blood cells move to one side and all the liquid watery component known as plasma moves to the other side. This shows us that when we take a drop of human blood, only between 40 and 45% of the blood is actually comprised of red blood cells. The other 55% is other stuff, including fluid. So if you take that same drop of blood, it makes sense then that what we could do is we could simply add more red blood cells. Instead of having only 45% of your blood be red blood cells, why not make it 60? And if you add more red blood cells, then you add more hemoglobin. If you add more hemoglobin, then you add an organism's ability to store oxygen. So that's exactly what marine mammals do. They increase the percentage of red blood cells per drop of blood. So they don't have a 40% red blood cell count, they have something closer to 50 to 60% red blood cell percentage. So what about increasing the blood volume? Interestingly, a study looked at various types of marine mammals, including, and used humans as a reference, and found that regardless of taxa, there's some convergent evolution shown with ability to dive and percentage of body mass devoted to blood. In other words, if you have a deep diver, whether it belongs to the cetaceans or the phocids, it's going to have a greater percentage of their body mass devoted to blood. In layman's terms, it means they're more bloody. So for example, if you take the average human, about 7% of their body mass is going to be blood. So if you were to take me and weigh me, and you were to say what percentage of my weight is blood, it would be about 7%. And as a human, I could dive for about 3 minutes. If you take a beluga, they have about 13% blood, but they can dive for up to 20 minutes. What happens when we look at our champion divers, which are going to be our elephant seals and our sperm whales, both of which can dive for well over an hour? Well, of course, they're the bloodiest of them all. They have over 20% of their volume by blood. That means when you take a look at a massive elephant seal or a massive sperm whale, if you were to weigh it, 20% of its weight or more would be blood. That's impressive. So with that, let's actually turn to the phocids. Now the phocids, as a rule, tend to be deep divers. And of course, within the phocids, we have our elephant seals, which are champion divers capable of diving for an hour or more. Now the phocids actually exhibit some really cool circulatory system adaptations that help them load up with oxygen. They have areas in their body where they actually put blood away as something of a bank for when they dive. And those areas are actually shown on this diagram here. This right here is meant to represent the hepatic sinus. Now the hepatic sinus is meant to be a vein that is associated with the liver. And in most terrestrial mammals, it's not that big. In fact, it's not even close to being that big. Next to the hepatic sinus and kind of branching off of it is the spleen. Now, why is this important? Well, if we travel a little bit upstream from this blood vessel, we notice that right here we have what's called a sphincter. A sphincter is going to be a smooth muscle. Think of it like a series of rubber bands that can contract or expand. When it contracts, it actually stops the flow of blood from the hepatic sinus forward to the heart. When it expands, it opens up that passageway and blood can flow freely. So why is this useful? Well, it turns out that when a phocid or a seal gets ready to dive, what they do is they actually take the blood that's stored in the hepatic sinus and the spleen, and it's very well oxygenated, fresh blood, and they infuse it into the body. So they have an actual true store of blood that they don't normally use unless they're getting ready for a deep dive. So imagine for a moment if you were diving and suddenly somebody said, hey, I've got an extra couple liters of blood I can add to your circulatory system to help you basically hold your breath for longer. You'd be like, this is great. And that's exactly what the phocids are able to do, which is amazing. Now, so once they dive and they basically infuse this fresh new amount of blood that they don't normally use, they go ahead and use it up during the dive, but that means when they come to the surface, they're going to have to replenish that. In other words, that store will have been depleted, and so they're going to need to replenish that. That, of course, affects their breathing pattern. So unlike a lot of marine mammals that actually breathe, almost hyperventilate in front of a deep dive so that they load up on oxygen before they go down, phocids actually show that trend when they come back from a deep dive. So they'll come up to the surface and then you'll see them kind of panting or hyperventilating, taking a series of quick breaths to try to add that oxygen back. And they have to do it more so than maybe other marine mammals because they're trying to re-add that oxygen to the red blood cells that then they're going to store back into their hepatic sinus and their spleen simply by contracting that sphincter. And in doing so, they make their store for the next deep dive. And now that we've covered some of the adaptations in terms of oxygen loading, I will see you next time.